classroom intro.
Okay.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Hope you guys are doing well. I believe you are watching this on a Tuesday morning. So happy Tuesday morning to you. And joining me today is Tom Horsman, who works with the city of Sandusky doing city planning. And one of the really critical questions that we need to understand at this point in our class, we've already talked about like what makes a school and what makes each school community different. And we're going to kind of broaden our perspective today and talk about neighborhoods and kind of understand what is a neighborhood and why are neighborhoods important and how do we make them stronger. So Tom, good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this.
Awesome. Can you give a little introduction to yourself to the students so they kind of understand your background and a little bit about like what city planning is?
Sure. So I'm originally from Cleveland. I grew up on the west side in a neighborhood called West Boulevard. As typical in most of Cleveland neighborhoods, they're named after the big street that runs through them. And so I went to college in Washington, D.C., so lived in D.C. for many years, which is obviously a city much larger than Cleveland or Toledo, but was a really exciting time. But then decided I wanted to come back to Ohio, so moved back to Cleveland, got my graduate degree in city planning at Cleveland State, and then was looking for a job. And there was an opening here in Sandusky in city planning, which obviously is much smaller than Cleveland. But there is a city manager here and city commission here that are really doing some cool things with revitalizing the city, the downtown, the neighborhoods. And I thought it'd be a cool opportunity. And so I moved out here from Cleveland, and I've been here for about 2.5 years now, working in the city planning division. And actually just recently took over the responsibilities for managing the Sandusky transit system. So I think the interesting thing about neighborhoods and cities is even in a small city like Sandusky, there's so many things that are very similar to bigger cities like Toledo, Cleveland, DC. Obviously things that are very different, but cities all kind of have a common traits about them that are all similar across the board and have been for thousands and thousands of years going back. So I think city planning is something that's often difficult to define, and I think people don't often really even know what it is that I do. And it's a lot of different things. It's one from a basic policy level of looking at boring things like zoning, signing off on a shed permit for somebody to put in their backyard, but then also looking at big picture planning. So kind of taking a holistic look at the city and saying, where does the city want to be in 10, 15, 20, 50 years? What can we do to get there? And then what kind of incremental steps can we make along the way to make it a better place? And city planners have a lot of ideas, and we share a lot of ideas about what works, what doesn't. Unfortunately, planners in this day and age are always the decision makers. Those are the politicians and city council and mayors, and there's always a back and forth, right, about what is actually good for the city versus what is politically popular. And so it's a complicated process, but it's a fun field, and I think cities are really exciting places to be, and there's a lot always going on and a lot to learn. So it's a fun field to be in.
This is probably a little bit off the topic of neighborhoods, but I feel like I'd be committing malpractice as a history teacher if I don't ask it. To what degree does the past impact your job in city planning? Like, how much do you guys refer back to Sandusky's history in planning for Sandusky's future?
Yeah, I do all the time. We're going through a downtown master planning process right now. And as part of that, I've dug through past downtown plans going back to the 1950s. And it's interesting, some of the same things keep reoccurring in each plan time and time again. Like there's been certain paragraphs where it's been almost verbatim the same exact thing. Like, we need to do this on the waterfront. We need to do this on such and such street. And you do see some progress that has been made over time. But I think it's really important to see what has happened before and help that inform where you want to go, and then also see like what ideas did not work and try to avoid some of those things. But also, like when it comes to neighborhood planning too, I think having a history of the neighborhood, of the place, what do people who've lived there a long time, what do they think of it? What's the neighborhood gone through? What's its identity? So I think, you really need to have a good idea of where cities come from in order to figure out where you want it to go. And that doesn't mean you should, box yourself in and not advocate for change, and keeping things the same. But I think having the context is really, really important.
Yeah, totally. So I guess that's a great pivot point for us to start talking about like what a neighborhood actually is. So when you're learning this stuff in college, how do they talk about what a neighborhood is?
So defining a neighborhood is something that's not easy, and there's really no one definite. I mean, there's a definition in the dictionary, I'm sure, but it it means so many different things to so many different people. And I think, when you're learning about neighborhoods and planning, it's often aspirational, right? And I think there's certain things like, oh, a neighborhood should have defined characteristics. A neighborhood should have like a center, whether that be like a park or a gazebo or a main commercial district. A neighborhood should have defined boundaries, right? Like you should know, like, you're entering a neighborhood at a certain point. A neighborhood should have a vibrant community where people, I guess that means two different things. One, like, it has a vibrant street life. You see people out and about, there's eyes on the street. But then also the community from the sense of there's you feel like you're part of this group. This group has political power in some sorts. Like, you can advocate for your neighborhood. You can be the voice of your neighborhood. And so I think those are all things that you would say you want a neighborhood to be. But I think especially in cities like Cleveland, Toledo, Sandusky to an extent, as cities hollowed out over decades and decades, we've lost a lot of those things. So I think a lot of the neighborhoods we have may not conform to those definitions or things that we want. So that's what makes it difficult to really kind of define, and there's lots of issues that come about with that, especially as you're trying to revitalize certain areas and cities and try to give names to certain areas to help make them more attractive, and then people who have lived there a long time don't really feel any connection to that new name. So it gets pretty complicated. But those three things I mentioned earlier, I think, are the things that we will, at least as we're trying to rebuild neighborhoods, trying to get them back to having all of those characteristics.
So if I can bring in kind of a Toledo example, a number of you guys in my class right now who go to Scott and Woodward kind of live along LaGrange, like between Cherry and Point Place in the old Polish neighborhood of Lagrinka, which has very few Polish people in it anymore. And the neighborhood initially, if we roll back to the 1880s, is really defined by that one characteristic, which is being Polish. Do neighborhoods change over time, Tom? Do neighborhood boundaries and identities change over time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and the interesting thing about Toledo, and I think growing up in Cleveland, it's very similar. It's almost the same thing, just different names and different geographies. But neighborhoods and cities change, and I think we, in the United States, especially, being such relatively younger country compared to the rest of the world, may not always grasp that, but cities have been changing for thousands and thousands of years, and cities are not meant to be just stuck in stone and be the same thing that they've always been. And so in Toledo and Cleveland, every individual neighborhood had its own ethnic identity, whether it was Polish, Italian, Irish, whatever it may be, Hungarian. And they all had their own church, most especially in these cities. And so as these things change, there's always there's a tough dynamic. And I think like a really interesting example is if you go up 75 a little bit to Detroit, where Hamtramck is, a really historic old Polish city, and still actually pretty vibrant compared to the rest of Detroit. But it's also one of the largest percentage cities of a Muslim population. I think even the majority of city council is now Muslim, and I know that's causes a lot of issues, right? Because a lot of the old Polish people that live there feel like their neighborhood's changing and it looks very different than their Polish Catholic neighborhood did. But I think we have to realize that that's okay. There's still people living there. There's life on the street. They may speak different languages. They may dress differently. They practice different religions. And I think it's good to maintain a historic sense of what the neighborhood was, whether that's through placemaking, signage, events. And it's good to recognize the history, but we don't want to, stop history from moving on and prevent people from moving somewhere or recognizing a new identity. So, I think we want neighborhoods to be vibrant and for people to live in them and be good communities. And that's not going to look the same way it did. We're not going to have a Polish church, a German church, a Hungarian church in every little neighborhood anymore. And we need to recognize that and be okay with that. And I think that's great. And that's fine.
What are some of the ways? I'm so sorry because now I'm going off script with the questions that I brought in at the beginning of this. But like you were talking about, like the Polish church, German church, etc. And students, some of you who live on the South End live near like Junction in Nebraska, where the old St. Anthony's is. It's one of the tallest buildings in town, and that's one of those landmarks that every kid in South Toledo knows. But in our case, a lot of you probably didn't know that was kind of the heart of the old South End Polish neighborhood. What are some of the ways that a person walking around their neighborhood can kind of look for the identity of the past? Are there ways to do that? Are there little detective clues they can look for around the neighborhood to kind of learn about what this place was prior?
Yeah, I think even in neighborhoods that really don't have much of that identity left, I think there are still lots of pieces. Obviously, St. Anthony's is a great example. I remember driving through Toledo once and I came across St. Anthony's and was just like blown away by how immense of a structure it was and beautiful. And then I started reading the history about it and realized it was about to be torn down. And then I think now it's actually been being preserved, right?
Yeah, the city purchased it and the city stabilized the structure to do something with it.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because I do think, obviously it's not ever going to be a church, probably most likely, and a lot of churches have been reused. In Cleveland, there's a church that just recently got converted into condominiums. There's churches in Pittsburgh and Cincinnati that have been turned into breweries, and so they still maintain this sort of visual connection to what the neighborhood was in the past. Other neighborhoods have done things where they do street sign toppers, then sort of give a visual identity to what the neighborhood was, or there's certain street names even that relate to the nationality that was in that neighborhood, or there's often remnants, maybe a business or two that's remaining that traces its history back to when that neighborhood was a more vibrant ethnic area.
Woodward students, you guys will notice that with Stanley's, right? Stanley's Meat Market up by Woodward High School is kind of that last outpost of Polish.
Right. And so you still have a lot of people that, maybe grew up in the neighborhood or even whose parents or grandparents did, but will still come back to that place year for generations because it has that history to them and that importance to them. And even churches to an extent, even, there's a lot fewer of them, but even if there are certain neighborhood churches, a lot of people will maybe drive a longer time to go there because it's part of their community identity. I think as time goes on, there's probably fewer and fewer people that do that, unfortunately. So I think we're going to need to figure out, what do we do with these churches that close, and how can we preserve them in a way that's connects with the history, but that's also useful for the people that live in the neighborhood. Because I think sometimes too, we need to recognize that there are actually people that live in this neighborhood that don't have any historic connections. So you don't want to make the people that live there now feel like they're, imposing on this former Polish neighborhood and overdo it with the branding of things. So I think it's a really delicate balance between the two. We want people to live there and feel welcome, but also try to maintain that continuity of history.
It's kind of strange. Kind of what I hear you saying is that neighborhoods belong to both the past and the present, and there's going to be a tension between those two things.
Yeah, I think so. And I think you see that too, even like I mentioned, renaming neighborhoods. Like again, if you Detroit is another example that comes up where there's now this neighborhood, Midtown, right? And it's a sort of growing area and lots of building. And, I believe the former name, like Cass Corridor, is what people refer to it as. So there's a lot of people who live there that, like, what is this Midtown? So it's just like people are kind of creating this thing out of nowhere that has no identity to the people that have lived there, and trying to get people to move in and make it more attractive. So again, you need to be careful about that. Certain sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I think some of our students are probably familiar with that, because if you live near Woodward High School, you've probably seen signs that say One Village, ONE Village, for Old North End Village, which is the old downtown of La Grinka. And if you live kind of near St. Anthony's, down Junction, Nebraska way, you've seen signs that say Onyx, which is kind of the rebranding of that neighborhood today.
Yeah, I think that happens all the time. And even in Cleveland, there's the Ohio City neighborhood, and then there's been like a rebranding even of like a small portion of that neighborhood to what's called Hingetown, which has really been exploding. And that's something that we see a lot. It's something that we kind of have to just be careful of. But again, neighborhoods are complicated.
And I think it's worth noting too, at least in Toledo's experience, that the eastern end of Kuschwans was an old German neighborhood called Lanks Hill, and that the Germans kind of took great umbrage when the Poles came in. Well, what are you doing calling this area Kuschwans, 100 years ago?
Right. I think that's so true. I think even when you dig back into like newspaper archives back in history, you often hear same things that people complain about now, or the problems we have now were the same then, just in different ways, right? And that goes back to your earlier question: is how about cities changing? And there's been people have had issues, or I think sometimes we romanticize the past a little bit and think like, oh, this was a great Hungarian neighborhood, it was perfect, and there was nothing wrong with it. I wish we could go back to that. We also have to recognize like there was lots of issues too. There was lots of racial resentment. There was lots of people did not always get along with the different neighborhood areas. And so I think in some ways we actually have progressed a lot of ways in that. So I think that's an important context to really keep in mind.
So with all of this in mind, what is the enduring importance of a neighborhood?
I mean, really, a neighborhood is the basic building block of a city. I mean, if you take a neighborhood at a really small level where it's totally insular in the middle of nowhere, we call it's a village, right? And then once you get a few neighborhoods that prop up together around maybe a little downtown, we call that a town. And then when you're in a place with multiple neighborhoods all surrounding each other with a larger central business district, it's a city. And so I think neighborhoods are something that are common, whether you go to whether you go down to Bowling Green or Perrysburg, or wherever you go, Toledo, they're the basic place of community where people live and where activity happens. And so I think they're really important in that way, in that we want people to be able to obviously live in good housing, but also have all their needs for their daily life met within their neighborhood. And I think that's the one thing that we've really gotten away from over the last few decades, is that, if you look at an old map of Toledo, one of the old Sanborn maps, you'll see every little neighborhood had a butcher shop, a grocery store, a pharmacy, a saloon, well, probably like 5 or 6 saloons or bars, all within a little cluster where you could walk within 5, 10, 15 minutes of your house. And that's gone. Now you have to leave, sometimes leave the city to go shopping, or you need to drive 15, 20 minutes in a car, which not everyone has. And so trying to get back to this unit of community where you can actually, be in a place where you can walk to get groceries, or go walk to the pharmacy. And that's a lot harder to do, especially in a city like Toledo, where there's just not as many people that used to live in these neighborhoods as there used to be. But again, I think that's something that we want to try to aspire to make sure that these neighborhoods have all the things that they really need to be successful.
That's Students, I honestly can't remember if you're watching this video before or after I'm assigning this. So if it's after, I apologize. And if it's before, here's your little preview. You're going to be walking around your neighborhood trying to find the places that used to be bars and stuff, finding the houses that look like they used to be commercial, and then trying to learn a little bit about those places, because as Tom was saying, every neighborhood used to be a self-contained little town within the city. And I think that brings us to maybe it's worth talking for just a second. Most cities really focus a lot on downtown development and don't focus maybe as much on neighborhood development. Would you mind riffing on that for a second?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think any city you go to, whether it's Cleveland, Sandusky, I'm sure Toledo, there's always this refrain about why are we investing in downtown and not in the neighborhoods? And I think it does get a little bit more complicated than just that. I think obviously in order for neighborhoods in a city to grow and be successful, I do think having a really vibrant downtown is really important to that, because I think downtown is sort of the heart of the city, right? And without a healthy and good beating heart, the rest of the city is not really going to be able to flourish. So I do think stabilizing a downtown, getting downtown going is really important. That being said, I do think there are times where neighborhoods, though, are neglected and not getting the same kind of investment as downtown does. I think too often cities focus on really big silver bullet ideas, right? It's like, oh, well, we'll save the city if we can build a new stadium, or if we can build this. What's the mall on the river downtown called?
Portside. The old, you guys know it as Imagination Station, but the mall used to be Portside in the 80s downtown.
Yeah, and I walked through that a couple years ago, and it was like, completely empty. I think there was like one shop left in there. But I'm sure at some point they thought that was going to save Toledo. And so, I think we need to just totally change the way that we often think about redeveloping cities, and really focus less on the top-down approach. Like, let's have a big idea and let's put like millions and millions of dollars in it, other than this one thing, and hope it'll spread around. But really invest, in a much smaller way in neighborhoods, invest in people. And I think those are basic things like your streets, your schools, even just how your neighborhood looks, our sidewalks being repaired. What about public transportation? A lot of the neighborhoods in Toledo were originally developed once streetcars came around, and those were like the main ways of transportation between downtown and the neighborhoods. And I think we've lost that. So really investing in things like TARTA to make sure people get from their neighborhoods to wherever they need to go to work. And I think doing really small scale things, often doing them cheaply, seeing where people are going into neighborhoods and seeing where people really struggle, seeing what are the big issues with, getting input from the neighbors to see what they need, what's missing from their neighborhood. And I think cities just need a better way of finding out how to fix those things in a small way. Doing really small scale, cheap things. And if something works, continue doing it, investing in it. If it doesn't work, then just move on and doing something else. So I know there's not like an easy prescription there saying like, here's exactly what you need to do. But I think it's a lot more of using the people in your community to help build that, build it back up, and being less top down is probably the way we need to go.
And on that note, that kind of brings me to the third big point here. What are things students and their families can do, like measurable, small things that are within our power, things we can do to make our neighborhoods better?
Yeah, and I think it really comes down to the people in the neighborhood, right? And I think, I think there's maybe some people who think, why isn't the city coming in and doing this or that? Why isn't the city fixing up this thing in my neighborhood? And obviously the city has a role and the city should be investing. But also in a city like Toledo, the city's overstretched. I mean, they have to take care of a pretty large city that was built for a population that had many, many more people. And so they have a lot less money than they than they need to really take care of the city that they have. And so I think what I was just talking about before really does involve having neighbors and the neighborhood really get together and kind of take things on their own. And whether it's there's an abandoned lot on your street or in your neighborhood, can you do something to take that over? Create a little garden, or crowd fund some money, do a GoFundMe, and have people chip in to fix it up, make it look nice. When it comes down to it, the neighborhood you have ownership over, right? That's where you live, and you want it to be a nice place. And I think the city's role in that way should be finding ways to work with you and make it, not hard to do that. I think so often you see a lot of neighbors get together and do some really cool stuff in their neighborhood on their own, or with the group of neighbors, and the city will come in and say, no, you can't do that, and then shut it down, but then not actually come back to help fix anything. So I think the cities need to really find ways to work with residents and neighbors to find ways to fix things up. We have some people here in Sandusky that do neighborhood cleanups a couple times a month. So they'll get together on a Saturday and they'll get a bunch of neighbors together and they'll go to a certain part of the city and just clean up trash around, which is a small thing, but those things add up over time, right? And I think if you just have a cleaner street and cleaner neighborhood, that's one step to bringing your neighborhood back. So I think there's lots of different small ways to do that. There's a movement called tactical urbanism, and if you search like that term online, you'll find a lot of cool stuff. And it's a way that individuals and neighbors can do things to fix their neighborhood or their street in really cheap ways oftentimes. And there's so many different cool examples out there across the country of people doing that. And again, it's a time where a lot of times cities will come in and put the hammer down and stop it because they didn't get the permits or whatever. So I think you need to find a way to make sure to work with the city and do whatever you're doing. But I think those things are big in terms of physical improvements. But then also I think the biggest thing is just creating senses of community within your neighborhood. And I think there's nothing more powerful or more helpful for a neighborhood than knowing who your neighbors are, feeling connected to your neighbors, makes you feel more part of your community, of your neighborhood, makes you feel more inclined to want to make the place better, makes you more inclined to want to stay there. And whether that's creating neighborhood block clubs, whether it's doing block parties and closing down your street and getting together in a social way, those are things you don't necessarily need the city to come and do. You can kind of do that on your own. And so I think that's the most important thing. I think a lot of things stem from there once you kind of build that sense of knowing people around you.
Yeah. And I think that's so important, you guys. Like one of the most important things we can do is actually know the people around us. And it doesn't mean we always have to like them. You're not always going to like the people next door, but we definitely ought to know them and be friendly enough with them that we can all kind of be in it together.
Right, exactly. And even, that also makes you more inclined to look out for somebody. So if there's something happening at someone's house that looks suspicious, or if there's, something wrong, it's nice to know you at least know people who can like help check in on your house or whatever you need. You at least know there'll be someone that's there for you. And I think that's really helpful too.
Definitely. So this is kind of what we can do. What are the best policies that kind of cities and states and federal governments can pursue to really invest in neighborhoods?
Yeah, so I think each level of government has a different role. I think there's so much attention on federal politics, right? And we just went through an election where we couldn't escape ads and it was constantly in front of us. But when it comes down to it, what happens in your neighborhood, the Washington, D.C. is probably the least connected to what happens there. And that being said, I think the federal government definitely can do better in terms of funding housing programs, and especially in cities like Toledo and Cleveland and Sandusky that are older and really need investment. It's really hard to build new housing in these cities as opposed to like in New York or Washington, D.C. I think the state Unfortunately for us, so many of our state legislators come from rural areas across Ohio, and so there's often a lack of understanding about what the cities need, what the problems in the cities are. So I think the state can really do a lot better in terms of creating better policy to help these urban areas, and whether again through that's funding public transit better, schools, things like that. I think can be really important. The local level, though, is where the most can happen, and again, I think we have some structural issues. Again, you have Toledo, which is a sizable city, but you also have a lot of people that live in all these jurisdictions around it, all the suburban areas, and so obviously the people who are voting in Sylvania or Harrisburg or Maumee or whatever are not, that's they're not really invested in what's happening in your neighborhood in Toledo necessarily. So we need to really work together more regionally to realize that what happens in Toledo is going to benefit the whole region if you don't live in the city itself. But then I think most importantly, I think what we had just talked about doing some smaller scale investments in neighborhoods and working with residents to really kind of take the lead and be growth from the bottom up. I think cities really need to do that, but then also invest in things where they can. Whether even things like when it comes to a zoning code, for example, something very cheap a city can do is allow more flexibility with how you use your lot. Allow to have, right now in most cities, it's illegal to have like a unit in your backyard, like above your garage, for someone to live there. Allowing things like that to allow more people to be able to live in the city without necessarily needing to build a brand new house. So that was a long kind of ramble, different stuff, but there's lots and lots of different things that cities can do, and that all levels of government can do. But things won't change unless neighborhoods and people in the neighborhoods really get together and start pushing for that, right? And I think all the big projects that happen, well, that's because people who have a lot of money have ears of politicians, and that's how projects get done. But if you have a neighborhood that has a really strong voice, that are coming to city council meetings, that are talking to their city council members, putting pressure on things, and building sort of that voice, that can be really powerful in making change.
And this ties into something we've just talked about in class probably a week before students are watching this, which is why are Scott and Waite High School still around and Libby isn't? It's because those were the two communities that got incredibly loud to save those buildings and save those schools. And so you can say for a minute, my voice doesn't matter, but all you have to do if you go to Scott or Waite is look up and down the halls you're in to understand your voices do and can matter at really making a neighborhood stronger.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I think another really good example in history is if you look at when they were building freeways through cities, and so many neighborhoods in these cities were just destroyed. They literally destroyed them to run a highway through so people could get from the suburbs to downtown quicker. But you'll also notice that there are certain communities that don't have highways through them. Shaker Heights in Cleveland is a great example. And the reason is because they got together as a neighborhood and fought it. And obviously there's a lot of different dynamics there, and Shaker Heights was a wealthy area. But that being said, if you don't get together and kind of fight with a voice, you're not going to
come back and use this video clip to introduce Unit 5 in this class, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about when we talk about the Pinewood neighborhood, the Dorr Street corridor, and how that was Toledo's historic Black neighborhood, and the S curve for 75 just obliterated it in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. It's a sad history, but unfortunately it's a hard thing to fix, but that's one of those things, little by little, you got to try to rectify.
Definitely. All right. Tom, I think that's it for the class video. I'm going to sign off for the class. If you want to stay on for a couple seconds after, I'm going to stop the record. But thank you so much for your time today. And gosh, I hope when we are back in regular school in future months and years, I hope you can come in and talk with us in person.
I'd love to. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to end it, and then I'll talk to you in a second.